Cool. Lance, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Luke, for having me.
Yeah.
It's an honor.
Yeah. I'm really excited for our conversation today.
Me too.
Where do we start?
That's a good question. So I think it's funny. I reached out to you because I had seen a couple of your podcasts on YouTube, and I thought you were doing a great job. And I'm a mental health professional, and I know right now in the midst of a worldwide pandemic and a civil rights fight that people are having a hard time with their mental health. And so I thought that maybe I could offer a little bit of insight into that, what I've observed with my clients, working with them as a therapist, and maybe just talk about my life and what brought me to being a therapist.
That's perfect. Yeah. What did get you started on this journey?
Oh, it's a good question.
That's probably a loaded question.
It is. Well, I think it goes back to my early childhood. My mother has struggled with pretty severe mental illness for most of her life. She's bipolar. And when I was 9 years old, it got pretty bad. It got to the point where my aunt had to adopt me, essentially. And at that time, I started therapy. And so I like to say that I've been in therapy for, more years than, well, how many years is that? I'm 34 now, so my math is pretty bad, but,
That's
over
a lot of years.
20 years.
Yeah.
So that, I think, was instrumental in me wanting to get into the field of psychology. That was kind of my initial thought. Then later on, when I was growing up, I started to develop some of my own mental health issues, primarily depression and anxiety. And I think through that struggle, I came to have a certain level of empathy and compassion for other people who have similar kinds of issues with mental health. That's really the short answer.
That's amazing. What kind of formal training did you get in this area? Is it a bachelor's degree into master's? How does it work?
So there are different paths to becoming a therapist. I received a master's degree in social work from the University of Iowa. I just graduated about a year ago, May of 2019. So at the master's level, you can get a master's degree in social work, in marriage and family therapy, and counseling psychology. All of those degrees qualify you for taking an examination to become a master's level clinician. So my, official term is clinical social worker. But I call myself a therapist because that's what I'm doing. I'm doing therapy. I work in an office with other therapists.
So do you have an emphasis then in your training for a certain...
I do. In most programs, you have the ability to focus on, well, this is in social work practice at least, you have the ability to focus on more macro level social work practice like organizational management, running a nonprofit would be an example of that. Or you can focus on micro level practice, and that's what I did. In my program specifically at the University of Iowa School of Social Work, they had a track called family-centered practice, which was essentially clinical skills that you can use in the practice of therapy with individuals and families.
Cool. And so what are the biggest challenges you face today, especially with the COVID pandemic?
Well, I think I have my own personal anxieties and fears. That's one thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognize that, COVID-19 is real. It's killing people.
Yeah.
And I think we all need to take it, pretty serious. I was watching a very small clip of an interview that you did with Jeff Shipley. I couldn't make it very far.
Yeah.
But I think it's important for people to recognize that what he's saying is not true. COVID-19 is real, and having a strong immune system is not necessarily going to protect you. I'm certainly no expert.
Yeah.
I am not a medical doctor or a scientist. I wanted to add that.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. And he does seem to like to play the role of the antagonist a little bit, or a lot of it, depending on what part of the aisle you're on. But I will say, just briefly, that I reached out to Phil Miller sent him an email, sent him text messages, tried to call him, and absolutely nothing has come of that. No one, not so much as a, hey, thanks for reaching out, we might talk to you later. Now, some of his constituents say he might come on the show, but it's a little weak. And I want to support him too and give him a fair shot at this, but man, I was born and raised here, so if my elected officials can't talk to me, it's a little... But I'm still giving him that opportunity to come on the show, I hope.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you want him to come and chat with you.
I would really appreciate that,
You would like for his folks to maybe get in touch with you, which is certainly understandable.
Yeah.
I've met Phil one time, I guess back in maybe 2016. He seems like a really nice guy. And, when I was watching the interview that you did with Jeff, I was thinking, narcissism is really another pandemic that we're dealing with in our society. I have to make it clear that I am not diagnosing Jeff Shipley as a narcissist or as someone who has narcissistic personality disorder. The Goldwater rule is something in the profession of psychology and psychiatry that prevents me from diagnosing someone that I have never met or who is not my client. But what I can say is that I observed certain traits in the interview and, in the recent interviews of other, big political figures, including the president. And there's this deep-seated narcissism, which, it's pretty problematic. And I think maybe most of us, to a certain extent, have experienced feelings of egoism. I think it's human nature to want things your way and to be acknowledged by other people.
Well, with social media, that's just flying off the chains. I mean, a lot of the discussion that I had with Jeff Shipley was centering around his tweets, his various tweets, and how they, fueled these opposing forces and so on and so forth. But it seems like more and more people are getting lost in this social media swamp. I think swamp is maybe a good word for that.
I think it's a great word to describe what's happening on social media. I think probably most of us who use social media are familiar with that. I mean, there's a certain desire to have, people like what you're posting. And it's a kind of validation that we all seek. We all seek external validation, but if we're not rooted in an internal sense of self-worth, and the big question is, well, how do we do that if we're not already there? And I think most of us are not, or maybe we've had the experience of being rooted in that place where we feel valuable, even if it's a fleeting experience. But so many people are completely and totally disconnected from a sense of who they are, that external validation through social media or in other ways becomes the prominent way that they value themselves. And that's when it becomes problematic.
Yeah, I was reading something that was speaking to our generation, which is we're kind of interesting because we're right on the cusp of this internet wave that we actually still remember dial-up internet, landlines, all this stuff. Yet we're still interfacing pretty heavily with social media, and that's not like a foreign concept to us, whereas people who are just a little bit older, they're a little more removed. And then, of course, the younger generation only knows that. So I think it's interesting when you were mentioning your background in getting therapy when you did as a young boy. In that sort of analog world still, right? Where issues had a whole different kind of subset to them to where we are currently. What's your observation of that?
That's an interesting question.
What's changed?
Yeah. Thinking back to what the internet looked like, when we were 9 or 10 years old, I think we're about the same age.
Yeah.
There was no social media as such. And so, I think that people got validated in different ways. And so now, of course, we have social media, we have our smartphones, we're, on them a lot of the time, most of us. And, you post a picture or a quote or a news article, and you can get an instant feeling of worth and value. If someone likes my post on Instagram or on Facebook, or if someone replies to a Snapchat, that means that I'm valuable, I'm worthy. I think too that kind of segues into a lot of what I'm hearing from the clients that I'm working with now. They're telling me that they're struggling with feelings of unworthiness, and that, I think, in large part is related to the fact that many of us are isolated right now. And so the only way that you're getting validated is maybe through, social media or through a Zoom chat or FaceTime. And certainly those things are important. And I'm not saying that it's not okay to post a picture on social media.
No, yeah.
But, asking yourself the question, well, what makes me valuable beyond this internet world?
Yeah.
That's a really important question to ponder.
Yeah, it really is. I think one of the biggest concerns that people were having amidst this pandemic was this idea of social distancing, which, it's funny, we still have like one of the cheap Hulu subscriptions that plays like 90 seconds of commercials like every 5 minutes. And every single one, I mean, everything from like deli meat to like the new pickup truck, all this, oh, we're all in this together, 6 feet apart. And we turn to each other, we're just like, it feels very stupid. I don't like hearing when people say, oh yeah, grandma just died in the hospital and no one came to visit her. That pisses me off. Ugh, it pisses me off. What are the statistics around this social distancing thing? Isn't this just a totally new experiment? Okay, and so I'll preface that by saying maybe this truly is for our health, but what are the ramifications right now? Is depression through the roof? Is suicide rates, are they going up? What's going on here?
It's a great question, Luke.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any current data out there. I'm sure there probably is, specifically with regards to suicide rates in the midst of the pandemic. I would encourage people to look that up for themselves, because I don't know. And I would only be speculating if I said that it had gone up.
Yeah.
And I don't know that that's the case, but it would not surprise me if within certain populations, suicide is, potentially going up, because people are isolated, they're in their homes, they don't have access to health care or mental health care specifically, especially Black and Indigenous people of color. It's easier for you and me, white guys, to have access to those things.
Yeah.
It's tough to say, but I'm hearing from many of the clients that I work with that, they're having thoughts of hopelessness, that kind of border on the edge of feeling suicidal. And I think that it's important to distinguish between that difference. I mean, most of us in our lives have those kinds of thoughts, even thoughts that are suicidal. I don't want to be alive anymore. I don't feel like I have anything to live for. So, and not to downplay the severity of those kinds of thoughts, but I don't think that they're that uncommon. It becomes especially problematic when the frequency of those thoughts is increasing, or a person feels like they can't get them to stop, or if they start then thinking about a plan.
Yeah.
And sometimes that happens. I work with people. One of my other roles is just kind of like a side gig for me. I work as a mobile crisis counselor for Community Crisis Services and Food Bank, which is in Iowa City. And during the pandemic, I'm not doing as much work, because part of one of the essential parts of the role is for me and another counselor to go out to help people who are in mental health crisis in their homes, or in random locations sometimes. And
that's like almost being an emergency responder, is it not?
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that seems pretty essential. So is there like a mandate right now that says, no, you can't do that?
Not a mandate as such, but Community, the organization that I work with, they've been great about tracking the numbers in Johnson County, and they have services here too in Jefferson County. So for people who are living here in Fairfield or in Jefferson County, you can just Google Community Crisis Center. They have a mobile crisis team here. So right now, they're not dispatching counselors in person, but they still provide online chat support and also telehealth video chatting for people who are in mental health crisis. No mandate as such, but it's a state-funded program, which is great. So that means that it's free. Anyone can utilize the service where it's offered in the areas where it's offered. It's been quite an experience. I've been doing it now for maybe a year and a half or so. I think I initially mentioned it. I was talking about, the prevalence of suicide and working with people who are suicidal and the importance of them having access to mental health services. Part of the problem is that there's such a stigma with regards to even discussing suicide. And so I think for many people, they suffer in silence. And for some people, especially people who have underlying mental health concerns, they don't feel like they can reach out for help.
Something that's insidious about it is it feels like a trap in that it's quicksand. You'd want to reach out for help. You just think it's harder and harder, perhaps. Maybe that's a trending thought. Maybe it's not. But I wonder what's some of the magic in reaching out to people like that and changing the experience?
I think in some ways it is kind of an alchemical process. If you, someone who's maybe not actively suicidal or having suicidal thoughts, notices a friend maybe who you think is suicidal, there's a training called Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training. It was something that I completed early on in my graduate studies, and it's offered to the general public online now, I believe. And the particular format of that modality, it teaches you how to notice invitations to talk about suicide with another person that you think might be suicidal. And so then the question is, well, what are the signs, or how can I know if someone might be suicidal? And, it's usually the stuff that, that we think of. If someone is talking about death more often, if they're giving away their stuff, if they're making comments about not wanting to be alive again, if they seem especially distanced or isolated, depressed, I think that's when it's our responsibility as friends of those people, family members, even someone on the periphery of our social circle. It's our responsibility. It's the individual's responsibility to reach out to those people, to accept those invitations, because sometimes they're offered. For some people who attempt suicide, there's a certain amount of compulsiveness or impulsivity with that behavior, and so there may not be any signs. And that's a tough reality.
That reminds me of, what was it? There was an article about how to spot a drowning person, and it's not what you think. They don't look like a drowning person necessarily. So it was an interesting article because it kind of challenged you to transcend what your thought of what it was looking like to something a bit deeper. That if they're not going to be able to yell for help, they're not going to be able to, and you might see a hand kind of go down into the water. But I think that's maybe a good comparison in that how many times have we been in a room of friends? I personally have seen it a lot where it's like, oh my God, I just want to kill myself. And it's like a joke. It's funny. And I've kind of learned to think that that's not a joke. It's not funny because, we all know someone.
That's a common phrase, that I think is part of the lexicon. But, we have to be mindful of the evolution that's occurring in our understanding about suicide and many other things, and we have to change our language, and try not to use those kinds of phrases and terms, referencing suicide for friends or family members of people who have completed a suicide attempt. That can be very painful, and you never really know, right? So it's important to, be mindful of what you're saying.
Yeah.
And as you said, to take kind of individual responsibility to communicate with other people who you think might be in trouble. Very important. Not easy, especially if you're feeling, isolated or depressed yourself, like many of us are right now. I think it's still really important. And that goes back to the narcissism that we mentioned initially. The narcissist feels that they need external validation. They have a grandiose sense of self. They lack empathy and compassion for other people.
Isn't this a general trend on the internet right now? Do you think it's amplifying this in ourselves? I to some degree, see those qualities in myself. I don't like them. I see myself glued to the phone 4 hours a day. My stats will tell you that on my phone. It's disgusting.
It's a frank admission, Luke, and I appreciate your honesty. I think many of us feel that way, and we notice those patterns and those traits. But the difference between someone who is, who could be diagnosed with having narcissistic personality disorder and someone who has narcissistic traits is that the person who may have some narcissistic traits, they still have empathy and compassion for other people. Yes, it's true that many of us have certain traits, and it's sometimes, I think, those self-serving, superficial traits within us that we need to take a closer look at, because they're the things that can really prevent us from seeking out connection with other people. And I think that that's part of the solution to overcoming the depression, the anxiety, the grief, the trauma that people are experiencing right now. And it's also part of the solution when it comes to reaching out to people who you think really might be in trouble. There has to be a certain amount of willingness and self-sacrifice.
I love that you mentioned all of that, because I do want this episode to be about solutions and not just observing problems. For anyone that might be listening, I'm curious what some of the recipes for changing this depression in people has been in the last couple of months. Some things that you've noticed work for people.
It's a great question. I think the answer is different for everyone, and what I'm going to say is not necessarily rocket science. It's not like I have these wonderful special skills that you can use to completely change the way that you're feeling. But I do have a few things, specifically things that my clients have told me that they're doing that seem to be helping them to alleviate some of the symptoms of anxiety and depression. One of them, it's a no-brainer. I told you it's not rocket science, exercise and getting outside in nature, if that's possible for the person. I haven't looked at any of the studies recently on the correlation between decreases in symptoms of depression and anxiety and exercise, but there is a correlation. I think even, just 15 minutes of, walking can have an impact. I was going to say a profound impact, not necessarily. Yeah. But it can have an impact on the brain, the emotions, the thoughts that a person is having. That's something that's been pivotal for me, and I encourage many of my clients to do it. I think for many people, especially if you're severely depressed or overwhelmingly anxious, so much so that you feel like you don't want to be outside, which makes sense because we're in the midst of a pandemic. I think it's important to honor that, wear your mask and try to practice social distancing. And even if you're only walking from your door to the mailbox, I think sometimes for some people, that's a good place to start. I think many people are not, experiencing that level of anxiety or depression. And for those people, it's important to put an emphasis on, I think tracking the goals that you have. So one goal could be exercise. That's one thing that we know will, up to a point, alleviate a certain amount of anxiety and depression. Tracking it is something that's really important. I think for many people, that's kind of like a missing piece. For
like
me,
seeing is believing sort of thing, or?
Well, what I mean is, literally downloading an app to track your habits. So that means, you're setting a goal for yourself. For me this week, for example, and this was a goal for another client, I have an exercise bike, and my goal was to spend 20 minutes for just 3 days because I was feeling so overwhelmed with all the paperwork that I have to do and other financial issues and everything else that, human beings deal with, including therapists. Your therapist has problems. I should make that point known too. Sometimes there's a belief that your therapist has all the answers, and that is not the case. I think tracking those kinds of goals is really important. And I say goals, so let me give you another goal that I've heard other clients of mine discussing that seems to have helped. So cultivating solitude, that is more difficult to do for most of us. What I'm hearing from many people is that one of the symptoms they're experiencing with the depression is, a deep, overwhelming experience and sense of loneliness. And I often will ask my clients to reflect on what they think the difference between loneliness and solitude is. And if you can do that, and it's maybe a lifelong process for most of us, but even in the short term, if you can do that and come up with a goal, and another example for me is doing a Tai Chi practice in the morning on YouTube, 10 minutes. That is a practice that helps me to cultivate a sense of solitude, which is, I think, by definition, a feeling of inner peace while you're alone. There's not really the overwhelming sense of loneliness when you're experiencing solitude.
I still have this concern about smartphones in general that it's taking away solitude, that there actually isn't a moment like that in our day anymore. Or if there is, it's difficult to find. Yeah, I'm not so big on all this technology shit, even though I completely subscribe to all of it. I do feel at the mercy of it in large part. I think it's maybe even more of a pandemic than, I don't know.
Yeah. And certainly, I think that's true for a lot of people. They recognize, the evils of, the technology that we have at our disposal. And, I was mentioning it in the context of, using like an app to track your goals.
Right.
Certainly you could do that on a piece of paper. I think it's even more impactful if you have someone that can be kind of like an accountability buddy. For people who are experiencing severe depression, that's very difficult because, there may be a lack of motivation, a lack of interest in being around other people. And so forcing oneself to do that can really take a lot. But yes, so cultivating solitude, exercising.
Yeah, exercising is such a good one. Just the other day, I love playing music in my car and driving around. So it's very hard to get me to hop on the bike or walk down the street, but I actually did do that about a week ago. And it totally changed my world. It seems so basic, so simple, but the experience was profound because people are sitting on their porch, saying hi, birds are chirping, it's a beautiful day, and then you kind of get to experience your surroundings just a little bit different. It's more intimate, I would say. If I'm in the car, then it's usually easy to just kind of know that I'm going to point B. I just completely forget that there is a transition period from A to B that's actually really nice and alleviating.
I think it certainly can be. It can be a really powerful experience for someone just to take a bike ride right now. And I think it's important to point out too, though, that, there will be times when you're feeling lonely or depressed and maybe you can't bring yourself to do that. And that's where the tracking your progress is so important because, on those days it's inevitable, right? We're going to have those days, but knowing that there are days too when, we are able to get out and take a bike ride or go for a walk or do something to cultivate solitude, some kind of creative artistic project or a meditative practice or deep breathing exercise, yoga, anything. When we're tracking those things and we know that we're kind of building momentum, I think that helps to increase the level of motivation that people feel. It certainly, in my case, has helped. And, with depression, this is one of the side effects. It affects your memory. And, that's not really one of the side effects that people really think about very much when we're talking about depression specifically. You think, oh, the person feels sad. Maybe they can't get out of bed. But, it's a neurological disease. That's really the way that I look at it. That's a biological perspective. There are other perspectives which are just as important, looking at it from a psychological or emotional perspective, an environmental or trauma-informed perspective. That's very important too. If you can't remember the things that you've done in a week, which is something that I struggle with sometimes, and that's why tracking the helpful things that I have done has been so important, because I can open up my phone and look at the app and it says, okay, well, 4 times this week, I got on my exercise bike or I went for a walk. I feel like an older person saying that. That's a little bit ageist, actually. I shouldn't even say that. So I just feel like most people, in my age range, or maybe that's also a generalization. So I'm not even going to say that. Yeah. It's my own stuff. See, I have this hang up about having an exercise bike in my little apartment.
Well, you're such an eloquent speaker. I mean, clearly you've had a lot of formal training in this area. It's a topic I find really fascinating. What else? What else? How do you stay busy throughout this whole pandemic? What else do you do in your off time?
Yeah, very busy during the day. On average, I'm seeing between 6 and 8 people per day.
Wow.
Doing telehealth. So using a audio-visual interface to meet with them remotely. And it's basically like a regular therapy session, so that it could be anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour.
That's a lot of stories. That's a lot of personal, people who are suffering with all kinds of different things. So how do you maintain that?
I don't know. Sometimes I struggle. In my training, I learned the importance of being able to self-regulate, and I have to do that as a therapist. Yeah. I have to be able to regulate my own emotions when I'm interacting with a client, because ultimately it's not about what I'm feeling in that particular moment. It's about what my client is going through and how I can best assist them. In terms of remembering so many different stories, it's... I'm grateful and I'm privileged because people are so open and honest with me, and they share so many things about their lives. And there's a certain kind of intimacy in the therapeutic relationship as it develops. That doesn't always happen, but I think more often than not it does. And so I feel honored to hear people's stories, their secrets, what's going on with them in their mind. And I think it's so profound that I just usually don't forget it. Just in terms of talking with other people and asking questions, that's something that you and I both have to do.
Yeah.
Engaging with other people through asking evocative questions is something also that helps me as a therapist and helps my clients, but it can also help anyone. It facilitates connection, and I think that that's the piece that is oftentimes missing.
Yeah, it's so true. That was, again, one of the big motivations for starting a podcast, because I love this kind of conversation with people. And frankly, I wasn't getting it in the previous several months and so on. And my audience has already heard me say this several times, so I'll shut up. But being able to hear different viewpoints, even opinions where we might disagree, I think that's totally valid. I think that, I can't really make an informed decision if everyone's just agreeing with one another or afraid to speak their mind because they feel they'll get outed from a group of friends.
Yeah.
I've generally speaking always been, at least in my mind, the outcast. Again, it's kind of a construct. I do have a lot of friends. There are a lot of social circles, and yet I oftentimes feel in some ways isolated. These tools, these practices are truly for life, I think. I don't know. I forgot where I was going with that, but
it would seem that it's been impactful for you to do this podcast because, it's helping you to connect with other people, and that's something that you enjoy doing. You recognize the value in doing that, and I think you're great at it.
That's
I
appreciate
why I
that.
called up your lovely girlfriend, who I know very well.
Yeah.
And said, hey, I want to come and chat with Luke.
Well, I saw that as a great opportunity. I mean, I in my past, I've had therapy sessions with some people and saw tremendous benefit from that. I really felt like I had less of a therapist and more of a coach and a support, a friend that was really going to help hear the story and help direct it in a positive direction. So that was invaluable to me. It was actually really exciting. Once a week, I was like making progress in my life, wanting to share it with someone at a time. This was several years ago, at a time when I didn't have that structure in my life. It made all the difference. And, something I believe in too is that whether or not you know it, this level of support and listening is just so fundamental that my life today, feeling pretty whole and happy and supported in my life, would still opt for that additional level of support that I think it's a beautiful thing.
Yes.
Yeah, very constructive.
It is very valuable for many people. The issue is that sometimes, as I said earlier, people don't always have access to mental health care. And I think that that's something that needs to change. I don't have all the answers for that. I know Black and Indigenous people of color specifically have barriers to accessing mental health care. And at the organization that I work at in Coralville in Iowa City, we've really tried to put an emphasis on serving members of the community who, may have Medicare or Medicaid, the state health insurance that, doesn't pay as much as the private insurers. And there are those mental health organizations out there that will only accept private pay insurance. And that's problematic for me because what it means is that the people who need the services most can't access it. I think like a lot of white people, I'm asking myself questions like, well, what can I do to be an ally for people of color? And I certainly don't have all the answers, and I make mistakes from time to time. But I think it's a really important conversation that needs to be had, and I think every white person needs to be asking themselves that question. How can I be a real ally? Is my allyship performative? What is performative allyship?
Is that like virtue signaling? Is that what we're talking about, or?
That's a good question. I would encourage people to follow Sonia Renee Taylor on Instagram.
Okay. What's her background? I don't know of her.
I'm not sure what Sonia's preferred pronouns are, but so I'm just going to say Sonia. I don't know much about Sonia's background. I know that Sonia is a poet, an activist, an artist, a visionary. And Sonia started the hashtag Buy Back Black Debt. Like many Black and Indigenous people of color, Sonia did not have access to, the funds that some other white people have to go to school. Like it's not as big of a deal for many people. For me, it was. There are always exceptions, but in general, it's much more difficult. And search hashtag Buy Back Black Debt. That's one way that I think most of us can contribute to people of color is, thinking about, donating to individual people of color, or to organizations that are supporting that work. I really don't know a lot about that effort in terms of mental health, and I'm sure there is an organization that is fighting to provide opportunities and options for people of color to access mental health services. That would be something. See, that's where I need to grow in my own knowledge. I mention Sonia specifically because sometimes I get triggered by things that Sonia says. That's white fragility, and I think most of us experience that. And so I would encourage people, to take a look at things that trigger you. Get comfortable with that and really listen to people of color. Although there may be things that you may not agree with, it's important to really look closely at your own biases. It's a journey that we're all on.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I do think this topic of pronouns would be an interesting one to have. For instance, you mentioned, I don't know what her pronouns are. I'll just call her Sonia. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that surely there's good intentions in that I'm not always going to know what your pronouns are. If you want me to call you a certain thing, I'll do that. But, we make mistakes. I think personally, I'm just not seeing a lot of forgiveness in that area. That it seems to be very rigid in ways that someone might be like, "Oh, who's Victor?" That's my black friend. Totally pure, intentions, whatever. And that person might say, "Hey, oh no, I don't identify as a black person." Totally fine, but there's got to be that room for fluid conversation, in my opinion. That
it is, and I'm going to challenge you here a little bit, if I may.
Yeah, that's what keeps the podcast interesting.
Yeah, and this is, it's an important thing. People have challenged me in the past, and it's difficult. But I think what you said, and I'm paraphrasing now because it's already kind of gone out of my memory. I was trying to listen to what you were saying. But basically, I try to honor other people's preferred pronouns. But there has to be some room for forgiveness. Is that what you were saying?
Generally.
Like if I make a mistake and I call you by the wrong pronoun, then you need to forgive me.
Yeah. I'll give you a quick example real quick. I might walk into a room of a couple of women or something. I would be like, "Yeah, hey guys, like how's it going?" Is that in my world that's not even remotely offensive. If I'm coming from this loving place in my heart, which it's probably plenty of shades of gray. You could just hear the word guys. You could also see that my smile, my body language might convey something entirely different. Anyway, Go on. Sorry.
And so I think for some people that would be offensive, hey guys, because maybe there is a trans person there or a person who is gender nonconforming, and maybe they've been told, you're a guy, you're not really what you say you are. And so that's a trigger for them. So it's important to recognize that. Going back to what I was saying, though, I think what was happening, and maybe this was unconscious. I think most of the time it is for me, but you were centering your whiteness, because whiteness it's not just about skin color. It's about a systemic, oppressive mindset that's destructive. And whiteness says, my feelings are more important than your feelings.
I don't know if I believe in that, but I want to hear your opinion. I don't want to cut you off there, but
so with whiteness, the rally cry is, if I do something to offend you, if I do something wrong, if I misgender you, you need to be a little bit forgiving of me. My feelings are important. Or my feelings are more important. And maybe that's not what you mean, and maybe that's not how you feel. But the reality is, and again, these are my thoughts. The reality is that, for a marginalized and oppressed individual, I believe, if you believe in equity, and I'm more of a proponent of equity than I think I am equality. But if you're a proponent of equity, by definition, the emotions, the emotional needs of oppressed and marginalized people of color are more important, I would go so far as to say, which I know is a pretty profound statement.
Well, let me play off of that real quick. I like where this conversation's going. This is where I get kind of lost and pretty much uninterested in identity politics. You know, it might be someone's privilege to have been born into a wealthy family. I don't share that. I grew up with my mom. And, you know, we had enough. It wasn't like we were getting like Mercedes-Benz, you know, this and that, you know, going on like lavish vacations. So if someone rolls up in that Mercedes-Benz, you know, I refuse to be offended by that. That's just their path in life, you know. Part of me says I'm no more white than this person is black. I don't resonate with the white fragility thing. Yeah, I don't.
I appreciate the honesty.
Yeah.
I think initially when I heard that term, when I was my first semester in grad school, I not only did not resonate with it, but I became very upset on kind of an internal level. Angry, frustrated, overwhelmed, uncertain. And I think that that's a common experience because for many white people, especially white people maybe who socioeconomically were disadvantaged and had struggles in their lives, maybe they had, like me, you know, I impoverished, had asthma, a lot of health struggles. You know, my mom was severely mentally ill. Those were all struggles, but, you know, being black was not one of the things that I had to worry about, so I was still privileged in that way. That's the first thought for many white people when they're faced with the issue. It's like, no, but I've been through my own struggles, which is true. No one's denying that. But again, what's also true is that your skin color is not something that had an impact on that on your struggle. And so I think it's important to, you know, explore that, reflect on it, acknowledge it.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
even if right now, and I really honestly, Luke, I appreciate your honesty about it. You know, you say you don't resonate with the term white fragility, but it's very important, I think, to look into those places where we feel like we're putting up a block. You know, it's something that I try to encourage my clients to do as well. And I think it's important, too, to recognize that not everyone is at that point. But I still think that challenging systems of oppression, by definition, it means that you have to have these conversations with other white people. You know, people in your family, people in your friend group or your social circle. And, you know, you have to educate yourself. I'm not saying that intellectualizing the oppression and marginalization of a group of people who have suffered for hundreds of years and been murdered and killed. You know, I think something like 5 million slaves in this country, maybe more, probably more. It can't totally be solved on the level of the intellect. There has to be, I guess, a spiritual component. And that brings up something else, spiritual bypassing. I think often people of color, their experience, and it's very valid, I've observed it, their experience is that, oh, well, this white person, you know, they're spiritual and, you know, they're peaceful and they meditate and, you know, therefore, you know, they're absolved from, you know, doing any of this work. And I just don't know that that's necessarily true. I think we all live on this planet, you know. My beliefs and philosophy are more in line with Hinduism. Go figure.
I certainly grew up in that as well.
Yes.
Yeah, so I know what you're talking about.
And so there are many complexities, but and there's a lot of nuance that maybe is not always discussed. But on the level of the intellect, things can be done and things can be understood. The knowledge can be gained, and that knowledge can help us, and I say us, I mean white people, to take action, try to start the process, and it's going to be a process of demolishing white supremacy.
Yeah, I certainly believe that exists on some level. I don't feel the need to quantify it necessarily. I'm not going to deny that, it does exist. I just think it's interesting as we define ourselves in these different groups, because there's a race group, there's an LGBTQ group. IA, thank you. There's a lot of different groups. There's impoverished people. And of course, there can be a mix, every skin color times every, transgender, this, that. And a part of me thinks that we should return to being individual human beings with... Is that extremely idealistic? I want to live in that world.
It is.
I want to live in that world.
Yep, of course you do.
Do you want to live in that world?
Yeah. Of course.
I mean, I think we need reform in the way of policy. I won't deny that. And if someone's getting excluded from the party, I'm going to speak up. I'm going to say something about that. I think of myself as not just neutral, but an ally to all of these disenfranchised groups. But as soon as someone says to me, this is your, white fragility, or you need to seriously bend the knee or something, you start to lose me. And I'm not saying you as in you. I'm just saying that in this conversation we're trying to have in the greater context, it kind of comes back to that degree of forgiveness that I was trying to touch on. Now, I don't know exactly how I'd like to see that come out, but I just know how human I am and how many mistakes I've made in the past, where sometimes I misspeak on this show, and thank God I'm also the editor, because I can kind of clean it up a little bit. But the truth is, no, I don't believe anyone's perfect. And I might say something in my thoughts, beliefs, opinions that really impacts even a friendship in ways that I didn't intend to do. And so I think there needs to be this room for dialogue. What I'm feeling, or I guess this is a judgment, but my judgment is a lot of people are shutting down before the conversation can really resolve. Even if it's just to say, I disagree with you, we're still going to be friends. Or the boundary is, whatever it is that's healthy, that respects both parties.
I think it is common for white people to shut down when they're faced with the reality of what's happening to black people in this country. Because we, white people, benefit to a certain extent from the systemic oppression. In other words, the systems that tend to oppress black and indigenous people tend to support us in general. There are exceptions, but in general, that is truly the case. I was thinking about what you asked a minute ago, am I, this world that I want to live in, is it just me? And I said, no, it's not. There's a wonderful episode of the 80s reboot of The Twilight Zone. And in the episode, there's a white family in a park. And it's a beautiful sunny day, and they're having a picnic. And the kids are playing, by the pond. And the kids come over and join mom and dad. And mom is starting to feel a little dizzy. And then mom looks at dad, and his image starts to kind of pixelate. Like she's looking at a computer screen or something, and then his voice starts to morph. And then things get even weirder. And then she wakes up somewhere else. And essentially she's living in a dream, a fantasy, and she has the choice to wake up or to go back to sleep. So that episode is on YouTube. I wish I knew the name of it.
Oh, yeah.
The 80s reboot of The Twilight Zone is great.
Cool. I'll have to check that out.
So I mention that because there's a certain level of comfort in unconsciousness. And
I definitely agree with you there. Yeah, bringing things to the conscious light. That's where it's at.
Yeah, and it's hard work.
Yeah.
And it might mean that you have to, as you said, bend a knee. Is that what you said earlier?
I don't know if that's such a...
Yeah.
You know, when I hear bend the knee, I think of Game of Thrones, which was a pretty damn good show until that last season. But we won't get into that. No, I don't know if bend the knee is quite the right term. I don't want to see anyone go lower than someone else. I think that's kind of what it comes down to. I don't really want to bow down to anyone. I think that bending the knee kind of infers that you kind of give yourself or put someone else up on the pedestal. Yeah. I don't really believe in pedestals. So if there's a way that I can honor these groups and make myself useful and available as an ally and a supporter, yeah, I don't know where that fits in the scope of what were we calling it? Equality versus equity.
Equity.
Yeah.
It's a good thing that you brought that up, because that's exactly what I was thinking of when you said that you don't like pedestals. There's a wonderful infographic on Google. If you just Google equality.
Oh yeah. Watching the baseball game or something?
I think so.
Okay.
Yes. Equality versus equity.
Right.
In the infographic, it has someone who's tall. I'm trying to remember. It's been so long.
Yeah, well, so it's like someone who's tall can just see over the fence to the baseball game. Then there's the next step up of someone who's maybe of shorter height, still sees over the field. And then they have a higher stool for the third person.
They need a pedestal.
Right.
And the systems that we benefit from have provided us with that, and have not provided other people with that. Other people, meaning specifically Black and Indigenous people of color in this country. And it requires a certain amount of humility to really consider and reflect on, the reaction that you have when you're first faced with terms like white privilege or white fragility or waving my white flag. I don't think I really explained that term very well earlier, but for me, when I was in graduate school, waving my white flag meant raising my hand and saying, but no, I'm a member of the LGBTQIA community. I'm a former drag performer. I have all of this intersectionality. I haven't benefited from white privilege.
That's a really interesting topic, yeah.
That I have. So.
Well, in some ways, yes, some ways, no, right? Would you agree with that?
No. I would say that I have benefited from my whiteness. I have faced a lot of adversity, but my whiteness is not one of the things that prevented me from accessing the things that I needed to overcome my adversity. And in fact, it helped me to access those things.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it is.
But it's a great conversation, really. I'm learning a lot.
Good.
It's great to get these different opinions on the show. Or I shouldn't even have framed it quite like that. Just the fact that we're talking from these different backgrounds is incredibly rewarding and insightful.
Yeah. And I'm a former drag performer. Is that where you were going, maybe?
No, well, I mean, it's a very interesting subject. I think I've even seen you perform on the stage, maybe once or twice. Tell me what that's like.
Oh,
what if I may, what inspired that initially?
I started doing drag when I was 15, if you can believe that. This was 2001, 2002. I'm from Georgia originally, and I would go with my friends to a bar in Athens, which is where University of Georgia is. It was a college town. And at that time, they weren't real big on carding people. I was able to go in, and I met some of the drag queens who were there, and they encouraged me to do drag because they thought that I was, as they put it, very pretty and very real looking, which is a bit discriminatory actually now thinking about it, because
sure.
Well,
what if
trans
you actually
people look different ways, and
True.
People who are gender nonconforming look many different ways. But at that time, that was the prevailing viewpoint. Oh, you're very pretty. You're passable. But so, I was introduced to the world of drag performance, and I kind of fell in love with it. More so the culture than the actual performance part. I was never a great dancer. I've done like choreographed routines with the help of someone else who's really good at, choreographing dance. But I was never especially talented, but I loved the makeup and the culture of drag at that time. It's changed quite a bit now because at that time it was not mainstream. It was kind of still this kind of underground thing. And now because of RuPaul's Drag Race, it's very mainstream, which is great. RuPaul has brought drag to the masses, but it's kind of commercialized now, and it's not like, it's like everyone and their father and their mother are doing drag.
Yeah, we talked about that off camera. I love that show so much. It's been a while since I've seen it, so I couldn't speak to how it's changed over the years. But it's quite an art form, stepping into a different persona. Mm-hmm. And I think that doesn't that even go all the way back to like the geishas of ancient Japan, I think, were traditionally men.
I think you're right.
Yeah. Even in, I think, what is it, Native American culture, it's kind of regarded as for the people that can walk both, the female and the male walks, they had room for that in their culture in ways that we don't as Americans, I think.
I think some of the First Nations and Native tribes use the term two-spirit to refer to people in that culture. To generalize that, there are many different tribes and they have many different beliefs and mythologies. So I don't know for sure, but I think, in some cultures it was regarded as a gift, as something special. For me, it was a sort of spiritual performance, becoming, this like, not a female, but becoming something very feminine. And at that time, when I first started doing drag when I was 15, I had been bullied mercilessly in junior high and in high school. Every day it was, I don't know what I can say, but, queer and worse every day. Fag, I was subjected to those slurs, and it was very painful. And it really affected my self-confidence, my sense of self-worth. And so to step into this world where I could become someone else was very powerful. And it was a spiritual performance in the sense that, and this is kind of coming from a Hindu perspective, but there's like that idea of like the Shiva Shakti, the combination of masculine and feminine. I'm a devotee of Neem Karoli Baba, but I also have an affinity for the goddess Kali. And so, Kali is the goddess who removes our impurities and kills our ego and, does things to help her children who are willing to explore what humility means. And so when I would do drag, I felt like it was a spiritual performance because it's like I would embody that Kali energy, which is pretty powerful. It's a cool experience.
Really I've been in the presence of it before. There's just no denying it. There's something loud isn't the right word. It's very empowered. It's fun to watch. Really, because you're taking those derogatory, all those insults and everything, and I think it's kind of like the phoenix coming up through the ashes is kind of what it strikes me as. There's the energy that would hear those insults and not go on the stage and perhaps find a quiet corner of the room to not engage and get away from those people. And so when you get up on that stage, it flips the script on its head. It's incredible if you've experienced where the insults still come. But if you're in that kind of exalted other persona, I wonder how that rolls off you then.
Doesn't have quite as much of an impact. And luckily, I've been, I guess, blessed because, when I'm in drag performing, usually I'm in a setting with a group of people. This is not always the case, especially having performed here in the middle of rural Iowa, in Fairfield, Iowa. But yeah, there's a certain, I've been blessed because I haven't gotten a lot of, hate from people when I'm performing.
I'm glad to hear that.
There was one experience. This was quite a few years ago. I was with my trans mother, who was like my drag mother, but she's a trans woman. And she and I was in full drag, and she and I were walking in Athens, and we were, verbally assaulted and called, some horrible names. And I do remember that sticks out in my mind. It was scary. But I remember her kind of fighting back and screaming and yelling, and, she just let loose. And so there is this kind of power in embracing that divine feminine Kali nature. I think that most women and trans people and anyone who is gender nonconforming, who plays with gender, masculine and feminine, it's an inner power.
I'm just in awe of all performers, I should say. But, be it musician or reading poetry, doing drag, whatever it is, this fearlessness of being seen as who you are, showing up with what you got, and then just blasting it out into the world. My hat is always off to those people. There's just a wonderful defiance in it. Just ownership of the self.
Yeah. I think that's what's really great about you, Luke, is that you can recognize that power in other people. You're trying to showcase it, I think, through this medium. And I would encourage you to continue to invite more creative folks like myself and more, members of the LGBTQIA community.
I'd love it. I really would. I feel like I'm getting like maybe a doctorate in something as I interview all these people. I feel like it's like cultural studies or something like that and beyond. It's super cool. It's really cool. I'm nerding out on my own show, but it's really kind of you to say. Well, let me ask you this. Did we cover it all? Did we get?
Yeah, we went a lot of different places today, right? I like it though, and I appreciate your willingness to be self-reflective and to have an open conversation, with a person who has thoughts and views that maybe you don't agree with, and there's a willingness that you have to explore those subjects. That's very important. I think oftentimes people are just shutting down because there's a certain defensiveness, and maybe it's easier for you and me because we talk with people a lot, and so maybe there's just by nature an ability to deal with disagreements or differing opinions that other people struggle with. I think it's important for all of us to try to develop that ability to take a non-defensive stance. And it doesn't mean that you're not feeling defensive on the inside. You can be feeling defensive and pissed off and whatever, and still engage in conversation.
That's such an important lesson. Again, a practice for a lifetime.
Yes.
Well, I'm honored to have you on the show, and people are lucky to have you.
Thanks.
Being the great therapist that you are.
Oh, well, that's debatable. I'm good most days, but thank you.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess that concludes our episode. Bye, everybody. Thanks for being here. All right. Dude, we got it.
We got it.